Hong Kong's leader gets jeered out of the legislature. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, Hong Kong CEO Carrie Lam, who some would see as a puppet of the communist Chinese mainland government, appeared to give her annual address before the lawmakers in Hong Kong, and almost immediately was greeted by shouting and jeers. Pro-democracy lawmakers, and this is a report from the New York Times, pro-democracy lawmakers holding doctored photos of Mrs. Lam with blood on her hands, shouted insults, and played audio clips of screaming protesters. Now, Bill, you know that these protests have been going on for some months now, and I just wanted to kind of ask to start a really broad question of where do you think this kind of behavior fits in the broad scope of the issue that we've been dealing with, both the global condition of communist governments, as well as the recent things we've seen with the NBA and Blizzard Entertainment, Activision Blizzard, with clamping down on free speech on companies that are not even based in China, that are based in the United States, and this protest in Hong Kong. Are we at some sort of pivotal turning of the tide, or is this just something that will pass?
That's a great question. My first response when you told me this story is that these pro-freedom legislators sound like they're getting pretty amped up, and the next thing they're going to do is run down to the harbor and throw a bunch of tea into the bay. That's what it sounded like to me, to be honest with you. This is the sound of a population that is a genuine popular movement. It's the sound of a population that's really reaching the point of being willing to actually go out there and fight and die for what they believe in. It hasn't turned into that yet. And needless to say, if you take the People's Republic Army against a bunch of businessmen and students and whatever the case may be on the streets of Hong Kong, this would be a one-sided battle militarily. But they're not playing to the military battle. They're playing to the battle of world opinion. And that court of world opinion is much more powerful than it was back in 1989 in the Tiananmen Square uprising, much more powerful. We buy a lot of stuff from China, and so does the rest of the world. And if China were to commit the kind of atrocities that they're certainly capable of committing, then that is going to affect the bottom line for the Chinese communist leadership. And I regret to say that's the only thing they seem to care about. I don't think they're concerned at all about the lives of any of their people. Nope. In fact, the levels of pollution in their city give you a very good indication of how highly they rate the individual lives of Chinese citizens.
Well, we buy a lot of stuff from China here in the United States, but by the same token, China buys a lot of stuff from us, namely our debt. Don't you think they also have a strong hand in this situation?
Well, obviously they have a strong hand, and they have the second largest economy in the world. And many people look at China as, I know many left-wingers look at China as kind of this absolutely well-ordered paradise of community effort and plans from above, and, the whole 5-year plan thing written by people who, want to write 5-year plans. But China's economy is nothing like as strong as it may appear. There's just riddled with bad debt. It doesn't really have accounting in the way that we understand the term. So I think China's position is a lot more precarious economically than most people give it credit for, which leads us back to your first question, which I think is really important. And that is, are we seeing a sea change across the world now with respect to both China and to totalitarian governments everywhere? It's possible that we are. And the motivation hasn't changed. The motivation hasn't changed over millennia. This is no different than a peasants' uprising in Russia or slave uprising in Rome. This is people being tired of being told what to do. But the reason this one may succeed over time is because of the ubiquitous nature of the cell phone. In other words, China could get away with just about anything so long as nobody sees it. And if you don't believe that, then you might want to ask yourself why nobody talks about the 50 million Chinese that have been intentionally starved during the reign of Mao Zedong. No one talks about it. That's 9 times the Holocaust, more than that. But no one mentions it. And the reason no one mentions it is because there's no pictures of it. Same thing goes for the Soviets. There are very few pictures from the gulags, almost no pictures of people being tortured, none of people being tortured in the Lubyanka and so on. So since there's no photographic record, it didn't exist in the consciousness of the world. And the days of China being able to do these kind of things and seal the borders of information are long past.
In moments after a protester was shot in the chest by Hong Kong security forces, the app Telegram came alive with messages showing that video and spreading it around the world. Bill, Carrie Lam basically said in her speech, which, by the way, I did not finish the story here, twice she had to retreat from the legislature because of the jeering and the shouting and the protests that were going on among lawmakers. And she finally left their chambers and gave her speech via video, where she basically said that the Hong Kong independence movement will not be tolerated. And she blamed the unrest in Hong Kong on income inequality. Essentially, it is that the more capitalist Hong Kong, that entity, is suffering from a growing recession and economic woes, and it's not a problem of Chinese oppression. In fact, she actually said, Hong Kong is still a very free society.
Well, what else would you do if you were a communist dictator? And I know that's something you think about all the time, Scotty. You cannot say that we are determined to maintain a rigid control over how people think and what they do and where they go. You can't say that in the modern world. You have to have some kind of a fig leaf to cover your moral basis, and that's what they're using. And they're savvy enough, I might add, to use one that will certainly appeal to half of the United States, so the leftern half. Income inequality. Yeah, we can understand that. That's what they're up against. They're not up against income inequality. Hong Kong was famous prior to it being returned to China in 1999. It was 99 years as a British protectorate. Prior to that, Hong Kong was the one example in the world. P.G. O'Rourke wrote about this in his tremendous book, Eat the Rich. He basically said this is the one place where they've made everything out of nothing. They have no natural resources. They have no land, nothing. Per capita, some of the richest people in the world because they work hard and they're entrepreneurs. And if you look back at the history of China since 1999, when mainland China, when the lease of Hong Kong returned to the mainland Chinese and Hong Kong was turned back into a Chinese principality, you could make a pretty compelling case that China didn't absorb Hong Kong so much as Hong Kong absorbed China. All of the capitalist actions on the part of the Chinese government pretty much came after that. I've mentioned a few times before that I was working on a documentary on China as an editor before I did what I'm doing now. And we had footage come in from 2001 and earlier footage from 1996. So 5-year difference. You couldn't cut the two together. You just couldn't. The 1996 footage was people riding bicycles on stone buildings with dirt floors and everybody's wearing a Mao jacket. And by 2001, you're starting to see nothing but people with cell phones and Mercedes and so on. That's capitalism taking over the Chinese system. It's made the Chinese communists rich. But the problem is, and this is a systemic problem, which goes to the bigger question that you're asking. The problem is that you cannot maintain an information age economy if you're determined to control the information.
Well, your view of it is different than that of Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who seems to believe, based on the fact that his puppet Carrie Lam is giving this kind of a speech, that this whole protest thing is eventually going to blow over and he doesn't need to make any further concessions. He said in a speech, I believe Sunday, that Hong Kong is China's Hong Kong. And in a related remark, he said anyone attempting to split any part of China will only be ruined. This at a time when President Trump is trying to make a trade deal with China and seems ever closer to that, if you're to believe the stock market reaction to recent announcements. Does President Trump have a moral obligation to speak to President Xi on this issue and even to tie it to a greater trade deal with the United States?
My knee-jerk reaction to that question, which means really my foundational response to that question, is that the only moral obligation Donald Trump has in relation to China is a moral obligation to protect the best interests in the citizens of the United States of America. That's his moral obligation. If you want to raise it to a different level and talk about international ideals, which is very different than international politics, then yes, I think he should do that. And I think Donald Trump is savvy enough, in fact, more than savvy enough, to be able to play this one pretty well. Donald Trump is a negotiator. His book, The Art of the Deal, all of that. That was the thing that people who voted for him in 2016 were counting on. And as we just did a show on North Korea, I think he's done brilliant work with North Korea, and with China, he's now looking at a different situation. China has a lot of our debt. China's holding a strong hand. Right now, though, China's got a big problem on its hands, and it's not just Hong Kong. It's the entire idea of whether they can control that population as a communist party or not. So if your adversary is in trouble, now's the time to strike. Now's the time to get concessions that you wouldn't get if they were sitting fat and happy and had nothing to lose. So I think it would probably be a moral question to have Donald Trump come out in support of Hong Kong. And at the same time, I think if he did that, that would significantly harm the actual negotiations that he's conducting in the interest of the United States of America. So it's kind of a gray area here. I would certainly like to think that the president of the United States could be more open in his support of freedom fighters all around the world. But again, my first reaction to this was he's not beholden to the Chinese. He has no moral obligation to them. He has a moral obligation to look after the best interests of the United States of America. If that is what is preventing him from being more vocal in his support of Hong Kong, well, I don't know what to say about that. Although, certainly having watched the reaction of the Chinese pulling down, 7-story posters of the NBA because one coach made a pro-Hong Kong tweet, a guy nobody'd ever heard of, really, outside of his NBA team's fan base. If the president were to come out and do that, that would generate a real serious crisis on the part of the Chinese. And I suspect that the Chinese are in enough of a agitated state right now that would not only not be good for the U.S., I don't think it'd be good for Hong Kong. I think if the president of the United States were to come out with that kind of ringing sort of tear down this wall kind of thing at this time, I think that would force China's hand. And if their hand is going to be forced, it's going to be a bloodbath.
To the outside observer who has also had an opportunity to observe the arc of history with regard to totalitarian states and to communism in general, it is hard to imagine a path for Hong Kong CEO Carrie Lam that doesn't end with her standing on the roof of her building, waiting for the helicopter to get there to take her to the mainland. Do you think that Hong Kong's protesters should maybe dial back their intransigence where they say, we have 5 demands, not one less, and maybe give the CEO of Hong Kong an opening where she can retreat without being completely humiliated, but still get them a little more freedom?
Yeah, and that's interesting because it takes us to 2 concepts that are really universal concepts, but certainly most illustrated by Chinese culture itself. One of them is the idea of face. Japan's very big on this too. Every country tries to say face. It's not a uniquely Chinese or Asian thing by any means, but nevertheless, in Chinese and Japanese culture, it is paramount. So yes, what the Chinese are going to need is they're going to need a way to come out of this claiming a victory. And I think that is the best possible outcome for Hong Kong is to allow them to do that. The Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, who by all accounts is the greatest genius writing on war and the art of war, talked about how the ultimate victory is to not fight the war. And one of the ways that you win the war without fighting it is to provide what he called a golden bridge upon which your enemy can retreat. Give them a golden bridge to retreat across. That's exceedingly wise advice. Give them a golden bridge. In other words, give them something that they can publicly use to cover the fact that they are going to allow Hong Kong to exist more or less as it existed before. If the Chinese protesters are right, I think they would give some ground on that. It's hard, once blood has been shed, for you to show any sign of concession, magnanimity, grace, any of that stuff. It's very hard. But if they're wise, I think that's what they'll do. I think if they're wise, they will find some token aspect of what they're demanding, loosen the definition of it, and then give the Chinese government a golden bridge to retreat across. China will not tolerate Hong Kong becoming an independent country. That's just not going to happen. Without question, you will see Chinese tanks in the streets of Hong Kong before they let Hong Kong become an independent nation, or whatever the case may be. But I think they also realize that Hong Kong is unique. Hong Kong is, in a weird sort of way, much like Britain with regard to Europe. It's half in and it's half out. It's part of Europe, but it's not. And the same thing with Hong Kong, same thing with Taiwan, although Taiwan's a whole different issue. So I think if the Chinese are wise, I don't think they're wise, but they might be savvy enough to understand that they're not going to win this fight, that the only way that they would win the actual fight is to fight it. And if they have the fight, then they lose pretty much everything in the eyes of the world. The world will not tolerate images of young Hong Kong students having their heads blown off by Chinese tanks. It won't fly in this time. It just won't. Last time this kind of thing happened in '89, you could basically try to confiscate all the cameras and do a pretty effective job of that. And still the image of that Chinese student standing in front of that line of tanks emerged. And still that image is burned into the minds of every single person on the planet who's ever seen it. And that image is why we remember Tiananmen Square. And this goes back to my initial point. We remember what happened in Tiananmen Square because we have a picture that is in our minds that we can connect to. If that photograph had not been there, Tiananmen Square would have nothing like the impact on the modern consciousness of America that it has. But it did. It was the perfect image. A skinny student with his arms at his side, standing in front of a line of tanks that have already run over hundreds of his fellow students, and just the raw courage of it, the raw, genuine courage of it. It's a remarkable picture, one of the most remarkable photos ever taken. And that kind of thing is going to be seen 100,000 times a day if China decides that they're going to use violent force in order to keep Hong Kong in line. So China can't win this militarily. They can certainly overrun Hong Kong, no question about that. But if you run your tanks into Hong Kong, then Hong Kong isn't Hong Kong anymore. It's just an island with a lot of buildings on it. It's all of the entrepreneurialism, all of the business savvy, all the connections, all the money. No, gone. So I actually think that the Hong Kong protesters are holding the stronger hand here. But if they're smart, they're going to give the Chinese communist leadership a way to save face and get on that golden bridge that Sun Tzu offered them and have them retreat in glory, claiming a victory, while the people in Hong Kong get to maintain what limited freedoms they were given by the British and that the Chinese have been trying to take away.
Bill Whittle now comes to you 5 days a week, thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com who fund this enterprise. We also have a cooperative agreement with the Patriot Post, America's News Digest, and we invite you to check them out. We'll provide a link in the description below, but our buddies at the Patriot Post are doing good work over there. They're promoting our stuff, we're promoting their stuff, and we're glad to do so. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.